And as we said, what I'd like to do is to go into some stuff from Leonardo this afternoon and kind of begin to connect a little bit the dreamer and the realist together. So this morning what we did was to essentially go over some of the issues related to modeling and what modeling was about. We looked a little bit at Walt Disney and this general strategy for creativity and genius, the dreamer, realist, critic. And then you got a chance to do a little bit of co-modeling yourselves, comparing each other's different strategies for inspiration and dreaming, and trying out some new dimensions or some other additions to that strategy. This afternoon what we're going to do is go in a little different direction, in which we're going to try to actually employ some of Leonardo's strategy. So rather than just kind of use it as an inspiration, I'd like to try to implement some of the things that Leonardo actually did in his creative process. The first part, if you look in your booklets, Leonardo starts around page 9. And there's one thing I want to read that is not in the quotations that I put there, but it actually relates to our first activity. It has to do with, I think, a really, as I was saying before, a very basic strategy of genius is analogy or metaphor. And so what we're going to do is to explore some ways of doing, making metaphors and working from a metaphoric process this afternoon. In one of his most famous works, the book on anatomy, which was sort of the first really structured work on human anatomy, as far as I understand, certainly in the Western world, in the Renaissance era, Leonardo's work on anatomy sort of set the stage and has even been kind of the model for all following books and works on anatomy. When he was preparing to do this work, one of the things that Leonardo said was, I'm going to quote from his notebook here, his notebooks, he said, "Man was called the microcosm by the ancients, and surely the term was well chosen. For just as a man is composed of earth, water, air, and fire, so is the body of the earth. As a man has bones as support for the framework of the flesh, so the earth has rocks as support for the soil. As a man carries a lake of blood in which the lungs inflate and deflate in respiration, so the body of the earth has ocean which waxes and wanes every 6 hours in a cosmic respiration. As the veins emanate from the lake of the blood and are ramified throughout the human body, in the same way, the ocean fills the body of the earth with an infinity of veins of water." So pretty clearly, what Leonardo was doing was setting out to make this analogy between the earth and the human body. And one of the things that he says that he's going to do is to make a map of the human body the same way that Ptolemy, the Roman mapper, made a map of the cosmos, the earth. And so he laid out this anatomy in a very similar way. And to me, there's a very basic process there, and one that I think is also really valuable as a kind of problem-solving strategy, which is that when Leonardo set out to do something new, something that was uncharted, that hadn't been done before, he used a reference to something that already existed. So there was something that was already done, that we were already familiar with, and so he made this analogy and then set out to make his map of the body using that analogy. And I think that this is a very, very, very basic kind of a strategy. When we set out to do a new project or to organize something, we will often draw upon analogies. In the booklet, I'm showing an example a little bit later on. There's a few pieces I want to add first. I'm showing an example of how I used this strategy to help a man who was in a seminar. It's a case example of a man who was in a program that I was doing. And he was a minister, and he was becoming a minister, and he'd been given the assignment to design a series of lectures for his congregation, people in his congregation. But he wasn't used to lecturing, and he certainly wasn't used to designing lectures. So he didn't know how to start. And so one of the things I asked him was, what was something that he was familiar with, that he could do easily, and that he was comfortable with and enjoyed? And he said that he liked gardening. And so I said, well, to do an effective work in the garden, what are the basic elements that you have to consider? And he said, well, you know, there's the kind of soil that you're working with, the kind of seeds, the type of climate. And so we were keeping track of these as being the basic elements in this system, this deeper structure of gardening. Then the next step was to say, well, what would those elements be, just like Leonardo was doing, what would those elements be if you were lecturing? What is the soil if you're lecturing? Well, it's the kind of people that you might lecture to. Well, what are the seeds if you're lecturing? Well, maybe they're topics or ideas that you're going to, expand upon. What is the type of climates? What are climates? Maybe types of life situations or contexts or something like that, environments in which you'd be speaking. So he started to make this map of something that was new based upon something that was familiar, and then was able, as we'll see as we go along, to then create a lecture series by doing this kind of synthesis of different elements. Now, one of the other strategies that was coming out from our elicitation work this morning, when you were comparing your strategies and finding out about your own creativity strategies this morning, one of the other common strategies, certainly that Jan demonstrated, but also that Beth demonstrated, was taking different pieces and synthesizing them together until you get the right relationships. And this was another one of Leonardo's basic strategies. To me, Leonardo, in addition to being an artist, was a very, what I call an expert system thinker. What Leonardo would do is to go and look at a whole system, and he would really explore something as a system. When he went out to paint a picture, he wasn't just trying to copy something that he saw. He was really trying to internalize it. And if you look at a couple of the quotes on the top of page 9, I think it gives us some insight into how Leonardo did this kind of synthesis. So let me read the first one. He says, how to make an imaginary animal appear natural. You know that you can't make any animal without it having limbs, such that bear some resemblance to that of one of the other animals. If, therefore, you wish to make one of your imagined animals appear natural, let's suppose it to be a dragon, take for its head that of a mastiff or a setter, and for its eyes those of a cat, and for its ears those of a porcupine, for its nose that of a greyhound, with the eyebrows of a lion, and the temples of an old cock, and the neck of a water tortoise. So really clearly what he's doing is he's taken different elements that make up other creatures and tried to mix them together. And this was a strategy that Leonardo did a lot. Take, for example, the next one. I thought this is also very interesting, on the choices of beautiful faces. He says, methinks it's no small grace in a painter to be able to give a pleasing air to his figures, and whoever is not naturally possessed of this grace may acquire it by study, as opportunity offers, in the following manner. Be on the watch to take the best parts of many beautiful faces, of which the beauty is established by general repute, rather than by your own judgment, for you may readily deceive yourself by selecting such faces as bear a resemblance to your own, since it would often seem that such similarities please us. I thought that was interesting in two ways. One is the sort of the enigma of the Mona Lisa, where nobody can quite really make out what is it about Mona Lisa that makes it such a special painting. And I often wondered if that isn't actually what he did, because there's been some difficulty in identifying a real, it's supposed to be the Mona Lisa Gioconda, but there's some dispute as to whether that, I remember reading an account where somebody said it didn't, somebody who knew the real Mona Lisa said it didn't look like her. And Freud's belief was that it wasn't really Mona Lisa, that it was actually Leonardo's projection of his mother. You know, Freud did a very interesting study of Leonardo, pointing out that he was separated from his natural mother at a young age. And he goes into this whole analysis of why Leonardo was the way he was, because he was separated from his natural mother. According to Freud, it was a projection of his mother. On the other hand, I thought, based upon what he says here, there was an interesting computer analysis done of the Mona Lisa. And they said it actually has a lot of resemblance to Leonardo. That it was like, some people think it's a self-portrait or something. So the point is, though, clearly what Leonardo is saying is choose from a bunch of different features. He talks a lot here about synthesis. One of the things that Leonardo used to do was he would go out and he would make all of these different kinds of listings and little drawings of different features. For instance, in addition to the Mona Lisa, Leonardo also spent a lot of time drawing what are called grotesque caricatures. He would draw these funny little caricatures that looked like ugly cartoons. And you can see that part of what he was doing was he was sticking these kind of eyes with these kind of chins and stuff like that. And just as another example, before we go into this ourselves, he says, let's see if I can find one on his faces here. Yeah, he says, he's talking about the way to fix in your mind the form of a face. So one of the things that Leonardo did was he really tried, as I said, to internalize things that he saw rather than copy from nature. He would try to get it so, the map of it so much inside of him that he could just draw it without having a model, an external model. So he used to do a lot of these little activities to remember things and to fix them in his mind. And this is one of his strategies. He says, if you desire to acquire facility in keeping in your mind the expression of a face, first learn by heart the various different kinds of heads, eyes, noses, mouths, chins, throats, and also necks and shoulders. Take as an instance noses. They're of 10 types: straight, bulbous, hollow, prominent, either above or below the center, aquiline, regular, simian, round, pointed. These divisions hold good as regards to profile. Then he goes into a bunch of other ones, as seen from the front. He says, and similarly, you will find a variety in the other features, of which things you ought to make studies from nature and fix them in your mind. Or when you have to draw a face from memory, carry with you a small notebook in which you've noted down such features. And then when you've cast a glance at the face of the person that you wish to draw, look privately and see what kind of nose, mouth, etc. it has. So in other words, you could see Leonardo running around, and he'd look at your face and you go, okay, got that kind of nose, that kind of eyes. Then when he got home, if he wanted to draw it, he had this very basic set of eyes and noses that he would work from. So with a very few, in a way, with 10 or 12 different types of noses, eyes, and everything, he believed he could recapitulate, or he could draw any face by synthesizing these different qualities together. That's also how he did his inventions. You know, he would take different pieces and mix them together and synthesize them. So I think, anyway, you get the idea that he was working very much from trying to get the structure of a system and then synthesize the features. And what I'd like to do for our first afternoon exercise is to put these two pieces together. The first one will be getting the basic structure of something by analogy to something else. So in the same way that Leonardo started his anatomy by a metaphor to the cosmos, to the world, we're going to pick something that you want to plan, a project that you want to plan or work on, and we'll find some metaphors that you'll work from. The second part is getting a listing of a bunch of the different basic features. So I was talking earlier about the man who did his analogy to gardening, and he said, okay, you've got the seeds and the types of soil and the types of climates. Well, then we had to fill in what types of seeds are there. You know, so what types of ideas are there? What types of soil are there? What types of people? So you fill it in and then try to form your inspiration, form your idea by doing a mix and match of some of these different characteristics. So I think it should be kind of interesting to take on this little strategy of Leonardo. What I'd like for us to do is to start by picking a project that you can work with. So this morning we weren't really working on anything in particular. You were just exploring purely the process of dreaming. What I'd like to have you think about now is some sort of project that you're going to be planning or doing, and it could be, I mean, it could be something professional or it could be something personal. I'm curious what type of projects might you want to work on while you're here? Somebody have a project?
Communications.
Communications? So is a communications project for?
My own communication.
For your communicating with?
Improve my skills.
Improving your, so a project involving your improving your communication skills with others.
I'm trying to write a book.
Trying to write a book, great.
I'm planning a 2-day training session for trainers.
Great, so planning a 2-day training session for trainers. Any other examples or projects? No projects. What am I doing? Or maybe be thinking of some things, either personal projects like improving your communication or planning a trainer's training, or doing a book. A book is a good one. Okay, now here's what we'll do, and I think maybe I can just do a real quick demonstration with all three of you. What is something that you are familiar with? I mean, so I presume you're trying to improve your communication because you don't feel that you've mastered it yet.
No, there's a lot more.
There's more. What is something that you feel like that you know pretty well that doesn't have to do with communication?
Okay.
What would it be?
Creating or inventiveness.
Okay. So being creative or inventing something.
Yeah.
Margaret, you haven't written a book, I presume, before. But what is something else that you've done before that you feel real comfortable with or familiar with?
I can make a lesson plan.
Making a lesson plan. Great. What is something... Think of something that doesn't relate to designing a trainer course, but it's something that you can do real well. Or that you enjoy doing. Could be cooking or... Yoga. Okay, so if you look on, just real quickly, if you look on the top of page 10, you see that there is a diagram that shows something. It says familiar and then new. And let's say, if we were going to start with our first example, that the new thing is communication skills. And the familiar thing is inventing. This is with Gary. Sorry, Gary.
Sorry.
So, Gary, if you were to tell me what are like 3 basic things that you need to consider when you're inventing something, what would those 3 things be?
An outcome.
An outcome.
The resources.
The resources.
Desire.
Desires. Okay. You could say desires, needs. Okay. Now, in communicating, what would be the same or similar to an outcome?
The outcome.
It's almost the same. The goal of your, we could say goal of your communication. What would be similar to resources?
Different methods of communication.
Okay.
Styles of communication.
Methods and styles. What would be similar to the desire part?
Desire.
Desires. Okay. So actually, what we find is that some things are the same and some things are different. And that's going to, I mean, that's really our first step. Let's do it with Margaret. Margaret, you want to write a book. That's your new thing. But you're familiar with doing a lesson plan. So if you were going to tell me, what are the 3 basic things of doing a lesson plan that you need to know?
You have to know what you're going to teach.
Okay, so what?
The outcome.
The outcome. The what?
Or the goal, I think.
The goal. Okay. What else do you need to make a lesson plan?
You have to know the step-by-step.
Step by step. Okay. And
You have to have a format.
a format. Okay. Great. In a book, what do you think would be the same as the goal?
The
The
goal.
goal. What do you think would be the same in writing a book as the step-by-step of a lesson plan?
The step-by-step book.
Which would be what? What would you call that?
Fiction or
An
novel.
outline?
Table of contents.
Table of contents? Great. And what about the format? What's the same about the format?
A structure.
A structure. So as you see, what we're trying to do is to connect this new project to something that you already know. Let's go to our other one. We had designing a training and yoga. Yes. This will be real. Actually, what you'll find when you do our first exercise, sometimes what you'll find is the thing that seems the most distant is often where you get some of the most creativity, some of the greatest inspiration. So if you were going to tell me what are the 3 things about, the 3 most important things about yoga to know, to do it
There's
effectively?
the posture, the physical posture.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
There's the breath.
The breath. Mm-hmm.
And then there's the mental state, the awareness or the attention.
Okay, attention, the state. Great. Now you'll see it'll be interesting, because we'll say, in designing a lesson plan, what is the same as the posture? In a training, what's the posture? What would be?
I think the posture would be the content or the substance
Yes.
of the training.
Okay. What would be the breath?
The breath would be the energy of participants
Yeah.
throughout the day.
Great. What would be the attention, the awareness?
The learning states that
Learning
the participants
states.
would move into
Great.
and out of during the day.
Yes. Nice.
I make this stuff up as I go along.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's step 1. Step 1 is first getting the analogy. And one of the things that you'll find, like I think especially like in this case, once you get a good analogy going, your unconscious mind starts chewing on it. In other words, it's one of those things that once you get the connection, remember how people were talking about that they start to get these relationships and then it starts almost taking a life on of its own. So I think that's a nice first step. And in terms of chunking this, speaking of energy of the group and it's after lunch and everything, I thought this would be probably just about a big enough chunk to handle. You know, doing an exercise is about like eating lunch. You know, there's the menu, the dishes, and the waiter. Now, so what I'd like to ask you to do is just as a real short exercise, to get together just with a partner and to pick a project that you'd like to work with. And now some of you already did it, but I'd ask you to take, if you already did it, like Gary and Margaret and Helen, if you've already did it with one analogy, make another one. or make 2 or 3, if you have a little extra time, because we're going to only do this for about 10 minutes, it's real short. But use the time to make some different analogies, and you might find that some are much more intriguing or interesting to you than others. Okay? So here's the instruction. All we're going to do is that sheet on the top of page 10, the little chart. Get together with one partner. Pick some project that you'd like to work with. It doesn't have to be a big thing. If you don't have one, make one up. It can be an art project. It can be a vacation. If you don't have a real project, make a dream vacation. Or just make a hypothetical project like becoming a millionaire or something. I don't know. So pick something, because you can play. And then go ahead and find something that you already feel comfortable with, that you can be creative with or be inventive with. And just as we were doing, find what are the 3 basic things. If you want to add more, of course you can. We just start with 3 minimum. And then lay out, well, what would be the analogy in your new project? Okay? Is that first step clear to everyone? Any question? First of all, was everybody able to make at least 1 or 2 analogies? Helen.
Could I hear a little bit from other people about what sounds familiar?
Yeah. Yeah.
It helps expand mine in this.
Yeah. Request from Helen. I think this would be interesting for all of us. I would be interested just in what would be some of the new things and familiar things that you were making an analogy to. Is anybody willing to share? Yes.
I'm an excellent teacher.
Uh-huh.
And you want the 3 cards?
No, more because my 3 parts would probably be different than your 3 parts, but more the the methods.
So teaching, and what was your new thing, your new project? Or is it?
I'm working on my way to.
Okay. Yes.
And,
Interesting.
So what we compared it to is causes and roots.
Uh-huh.
What had worked in the past, and the kinds of things, not exactly rewards, but things that would continue that new self-awareness, self-esteem, and joy.
So sort of like, not maybe rewards, but reinforcements?
Yeah. Things like a trip or new projects.
Nice. Neat. Good.
I wasn't sure that it really related to my teaching stuff, but but it felt right.
Yes. I think that's more the important thing, is that this is not supposed to be something that is first of all analogies break down at some place. More the idea here is to get a sense of a structure in a system that you can use to help you, be creative or get some new inspiration or ideas. So I think it feels right. That's the most important thing. Anyone else? New things and old things?
New thing was playing the saxophone, learning to play the saxophone.
Yeah.
Old thing was playing Risk.
Playing Risk. By the way, as people hear the other thing you can do, remember after this morning too, is you can always go and model some of the others. So I think one of my dreams for what NLP could bring eventually is a kind of modeling community, where if you want to have a skill and somebody else in the room has it, you can go and find that out. Even just getting the 3 things can sometimes be quite an eye-opener. Yeah, a library of skills on the human internet here.
Yeah, and NLP internet.
Yes. So, Joe, what about for you?
For me?
Yes.
My analogy was developing a particular lecture series, and I related that to building a closet.
Building a closet.
Nice. Both of which I've been pondering doing for, but I finally got the closet built.
Good. Nice.
I wanted to try Anna's. I heard she did cooking, and
Yeah.
it was just beautiful the way she said that she visualized what she wanted to cook.
Yes.
And she would get the taste sensation, and then she would decide what ingredients needed to go into it. And
Nice.
then she would test it till she got it right, and that was wonderful. I could apply that to
Yes.
so many things.
Yeah. But see, I think, to me, that's one of these interesting things about genius, is that what Margaret was saying was that she was really fascinated by honest description of the pieces involved in cooking, where she said she'd get an idea of what she wanted, she'd get a taste, decide what ingredients would go with that taste, and then begin to start putting ingredients together until she found it. And Margaret was saying, wow, that seems like something that's so basic that she could use in other places. And I think that that's one of those essences of genius, is that genius is not about complicated, sophisticated stuff. It's about these simple things. And I think that's one of the things that Einstein would agree upon too. What are the basics? And I think that's where some of these analogies really help us. Any others to share? Yes.
I've been having some difficulty in the past devising a training program for my employees, but before I had this education that caused so much confusion in my life, I used to train horses. And so I'm making an analogy between horses and people.
Nice.
And it's already, in just the past few minutes, helping me get some clarity
Yeah.
for a logical sequence instead of just a big jumble.
Yes.
And I now just have to decide if they'd rather have sugar cubes or carrots.
Okay, well, let's take the next step, where we'll start then. We've got an analogy, and then we work a little bit more with the analogy, and then we do some of the synthesis. And I think that's where we'll get into. Also, it's kind of like a nice brainstorming strategy. And what we want to do next is to begin to get lists. If we make an analogy to what Leonardo was doing with faces, remember he said that you want to get the types of noses and the types of eyes and the types of chins. Well, once we know that we're going to have outcomes and resources and desires, and those are going to map into goals, methods, and desires, the next step is to get a list of some of the kinds of outcomes. What would be some of the types of outcomes that you could do in a communication situation? So what I'd like to ask Gary is, and by the way, if you get stymied or you get stuck with outcomes, you can say, well, what are some of the outcomes that I have in inventing, and how can I make an analogy to those? It's not necessary to do the whole analogy. I mean, you could, but what I'm going to ask you to do is to primarily focus on the elements of your new project, only referring to the familiar thing if you need to get ideas of how to fill in the list. So to demonstrate, I asked Gary, in the communication situation, improving your communication, what could be some of the goals in communicating?
Teaching.
Teaching. What else?
Passing time.
Passing time, having fun. Next,
Learning.
learning. How about one more? What are some of the other reasons that you might communicate to somebody? Persuading, negotiating.
Okay, persuasion.
Okay.
Persuasion.
So,
Pretty common.
if we hadn't been able to find one, what I might do, just to show you how you use the analogy, is I might say, well, Gary, what are some outcomes that you have for inventing
New product.
new products? Then I would say, Gary, what would be the analogy to a new product in communication? Do you have what would be an analogy?
Teaching.
Yeah, so teaching is your analogy. Or I was thinking brainstorming or something. You could communicate to brainstorm. But you see, the strategy would be we go through and list the pieces of the new project. If you get stuck or you can't think of something, we go back to the familiar one and try to use that again as our analogy to get the pieces of our new project. So let's try it with methods or styles of communication. What are some methods and styles of communication?
Metaphor.
Metaphor.
Using materials, other people's materials.
Okay.
Humor.
Humor. And again, and I'd like to do an example just so you get the sense of it. If Gary ran out or he couldn't think of what they would be, I'd ask him, I'd say, Gary, what are some of the resources you use in inventing? Can you think of a resource that you use during?
Different aspects of science, different...
So different aspects of science. And what I would ask Gary then is, so Gary, what would be the analogy to different aspects of science?
Different modulation, different tone.
Different voice, and so he goes, what that would be in communicating is different voice tone, different modulation. So that's how we get our pieces in the new thing, is we go back to what are the pieces, what is the list in the familiar thing, and say, what is the analogy? So the different areas of science would come out to be different voice tone. Okay. Voice modulation. Last, what are some of the desires related to communicating that you might have? Or
Fun and pleasure.
fun, pleasure,
Accomplishment.
accomplishment,
Participation.
participation. Oh, they're flowing here. Okay. Now you have a really powerful brainstorming list. And this is what, if you kind of think of how Leonardo, imagine Leonardo sitting around and inventing his machines, or inventing his animals, or drawing his paintings or his faces. What he would do is he would start putting together these combinations. Some of them might be grotesque, like his caricatures. That nose doesn't go with that chin or that eye. But some of them might be quite fascinating, beautiful, intriguing, attractive. So what you do is I would say, well, Gary, how could you put together teaching with humor in order to have pleasure? And that would be one combination. Or we might say, gee, how could we put together persuasion with metaphor and accomplishment? So the idea is you've got whole bunches. You'd be surprised at how many combinations that you can make out of that. And what I'd ask you to do, and where I would go with Gary, is go through some brainstorming. And again, remember what folks were saying this morning. Once you start getting the pieces, you start looking at relationships until you find ones that really synthesize. Okay? So you've got a pretty powerful list then of what possible ways. They're not completely realized yet. I mean, they're the seeds of ideas, though, for Gary to improve his communication. He can improve it by combining a bunch of different things. Now, some of them might not fit, or some of them might not seem like they fit initially, or they might seem outrageous, like a man with wings in Leonardo's situation, or a thing that flies by whirling something around instead of by flapping. But these were all seeds of ideas that became eventually helicopters, man-fly, stuff like that. Let's just do, I would be interested to do maybe just another quick example. I'm kind of interested actually in the yoga example of what we would do there for like training programs. So I'm wondering, Ellen.
Okay, so walk me through this one again.
Okay, you had posture was subjects, substance.
The content of the substance.
So
So what, between elements of
Substance, types of substance in your trainer training.
Okay.
What is the substance of a trainer training?
So, some of them would be different programs that our company provides.
Okay.
Like communications programs.
Communication training, yeah.
Problem solving.
Problem solving,
Diversity training.
diversity training.
Customer service training.
Okay. And what Helen would do is, with her partner, you keep a list of those things. What about, remember we said the breath was the energy levels of the students. What kind of energy levels are you?
Well, there's the first thing in the morning energy, which is she going to bore me to death? The kind of holding back and
Okay.
I can't capitalize it for you. It's the holding back and waiting.
Okay, let's call it
Anticipation.
anticipation.
Thank you.
By the way, this is part of why you have a partner, because it's not that you necessarily have to do it all yourself. Your partner might help you to find some of those labels. So we have anticipation. Okay.
There's the expectation,
Expectation. Great.
what they came into that training room to learn.
Right.
There's excitement.
Excitement.
When you find a concept that really grabs them and they want to run with it.
Yeah.
There's the post-lunch, I had a turkey sandwich.
Yeah, right. Right. I've been looking for a word for that myself. I don't know why.
Nap state.
Nap. Downtime.
Downtime.
Or something like that. Anyway, rather than go through all of them,
Right, that's
she would, again, you kind of go through those. The next part would be what we had.
the mental state or
The mental state, yeah, the awareness or
learning states, right.
yeah, learning states. What type of learning states?
Well,
That would be, and again, if Helen has difficulty, we go, what kind of awarenesses are there in yoga?
okay.
See, because she was certain to kind of running into a dead end, so we say, well, let's go back to what's familiar. These are the types of awarenesses that you have in.
The most desirable is the one where your mind and your body are one.
Okay.
Connected.
So
in
connect.
training, it would be when the learner and the material that you're learning match up.
Match.
Right.
So let's call that, I mean, for lack of a better word now, let's say, matching.
Okay. We can follow that.
Okay.
Then on the other end of the continuum is when your mind is chattering so much that you can't stay connected with your body.
Right.
And in the learning state, there is actually the same thing. And
Mhm.
as a learner, I'm so distracted by, thank you, it's a
Yeah.
distracted state. I'm so distracted by what happened this morning or yesterday that I can't stay focused on what is being presented.
Yeah.
So it's distracted.
Distracted. Any?
There's what usually happens, which is something in between those two, where you are bringing yourself
Yeah.
into awareness.
Yeah. So transition or something?
Transition, that's good. Transitional state.
And again, we could go on and I might have things like, maybe there's people that get analytical. We'd say that's a type of awareness, analytical awareness or intuitive or emotion.
My body right now, and am I
Yeah.
pushing my muscles far enough?
Yeah. Because, analysis is a type of learning style or state. So anyway, we get those. Now, for the brainstorming, since, again, Helen, the reason for doing this is that Helen has a real project that she's going to have to be planning, is we'd start putting these things together. How could we put together problem solving, excitement, and matching? What would that be like?
Well, since I'm going to have different trainers present pieces of different programs, I would probably, the trainer who wanted to take the problem-solving program would probably start talking with them about how exciting problem-solving is when people get a problem and they really find, oh wow, look at all these new possibilities.
Right.
What kinds of things can we do in this training session now to get learners
Yeah.
excited about problem solving.
Yeah.
And what's the third piece of it?
That was the matching.
The matching.
That's
So
a matching
that-
of mind and body.
So that when we're actually presenting this in our Train the Trainer Day, how will we recognize that our participants have lined up
Got
this
it.
material, that they've got it, and we know that they've got it, and they're problem solving? I would talk with the trainer who was going to present it about
How to
how
recognize
will
that.
we recognize this, how will
Yeah.
we calibrate it with this group?
Yeah, nice.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hey, step one done.
I mean, you can also do, remember Leonardo's ugly caricatures. We can also say, either what are the things to avoid, and what would you do if you got into distracted, downtime, and customer service.
Well, and that's perfect
But-
for customer service, because that is the challenge as a
Yeah.
customer service provider,
Yeah.
is you're constantly dealing with being distracted
Yeah.
by all the needs going on in the business, and
Yeah.
you do have downtime that you still have to serve the customer and make them feel like you want them to be in your
Yes.
business. So as a trainer, how do I help people
Yes.
deal with that downtime and still
Yes.
happy face?
Yeah. And,
That's great.
yeah, and by the way, if Helen got stymied, what would we do? We go back to yoga and say, in yoga, what would this be like?
Right.
It would be like somebody, what is the customer service like? Well, that's like, when you're doing something.
You've got a posture that you just can't stretch.
Yes.
And it's your muscles are cold, and
Right.
it's first thing in the morning, and you just
Yes.
you can't get your muscles to move there.
See, so you,
Barbara, this is good
yeah.
stuff.
So you go back. Thank Leonardo. So you follow the process is then you've got, and as you'll see as you keep going, you start really getting a brainstorming happening. And of course you need to have some way of then taking some notes about the syntheses that seem to really work. Now not all of them will work, so it's not like you have to write down everything. But what you want to do is to sort of keep track of a few of the ones that seem to gel. Now, we do, of course, the same thing with writing the book and doing the lesson plan. We go, well, we have a table of contents. What does Margaret know so far about her table of contents? Do you know?
Just a basic what I want to
Yeah.
write,
Yeah.
an overview.
Yeah. So do you have some words that would, if I was reading your basic table of contents, what would be in it?
You mean specific as to the nature of the book?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you want in a dog?
What do you want in a
In a dog?
in a dog? That's going to be one of her content areas in her book. What about another one?
How do you get it?
How do you get it? Right. Sounds good so far. And what would be another one?
What do you do if you didn't get what you want?
What do you do if you didn't get what you want? Great. So we put those as our chapter headings. That's part of our table of contents. And Margaret also had then the formats. Remember, formats for her lesson plan was the structure of the book. What sort of structures could you have that would be like formats in a lesson plan?
Specific things to do.
Okay, things to do.
Yeah.
Like?
I'll put it in a question. Question answer.
So question answer is one format. Okay, what others could you use in your book? What are the kind of structures are there? And again, there are two ways that we can go. Either if I have some ideas, I could help. I could say, well, there's interview. You could do interview, that's a structure. You could do transcript, that's a structure. I mean, when I write books, there's different things. Quotations, cases, stuff like that. But the other thing that we would do is rather than just suggest them, we would take Margaret back to lesson plan. What are some of the things that you do in lesson plans? Question, answer, maybe.
Descriptions.
Descriptions.
Break it down into little bitty.
Chunk it way down.
Chunk it way down.
Real basic steps.
Yeah.
So again, then what we would start doing in Margaret's case is putting together, you know, what do you want in a dog, and does she want to do question answer, or does she want to do description, or does she want to do little bitty? And she would start brainstorming by putting those together. The Leonardo, the author. Okay. So everyone, you follow the basic steps. You're just going to add, I would say, you probably need at least 3 details underneath each column that you've established. And when you get those 3 details for each one, then just take some time and start synthesizing them together and see what comes up. Keep track of the ones that seem to be good ideas. Okay? All right. Now it's about 3:45, and it's definitely, isn't it? It is, I know. It happens. So speaking of all our energy curves and everything like that too, it's also around break time. So what I'd like to do is to give you a basic, space of time. I'd like to say till about 4:30. And in that time, what I'd ask you to do is to take a little break and then get together with your partner, and you'd have about 15 minutes apiece to list, try to list a little more specifically the parts of your project and do a little brainstorming about some pieces that you put together. Okay? All right? Okay, see you at 4:30. Same partner. I think it's best stay with it. Okay. It's time to return. I'm, of course, curious about your experiences in the exercise. If there are any discoveries, questions, issues that came up, reports. Did anybody come up with any interesting plans? Barbara says she wrote her whole business proposal. Yeah.
But I found it was interesting because the first time I tried it, the new and the familiar were very close together.
Yeah.
And then the second time, this past time, I did something way
Yes.
more over here, and it seemed like this one over here elicited more, it allowed me to elicit more responses
Yes.
and be more creative
Yes.
than the one that was closer to it.
Yes. And I think, by the way, what Barbara's saying is probably one of those kind of funny but simple things about genius too, which is how far away are your analogies? I think it's easy for us, and it's a trap because it's easy. It's easy for us to find similar things that are not really an analogy. They're a surface structure analogy. But when you find something that really takes you to deep structure, I think that's where the insights come more. So that's one of the things that I recommend to people, is pick something that seems as strange and as far away as possible. And you'll often get more insight from that. So,
I did that one. I picked the one I knew, taking a nap. And then when I didn't know, cleaning the house.
Cleaning the house. Now, Alex, tell me, what did you come up with there?
It worked, much to my
Surprise.
surprise.
Well, you know that they say, it's sort of a truism, that often the biggest innovations in a field come from people that are outside of that field. Even if you take something like neurolinguistic programming came from John Grinder, who was a linguist, and before that, a CIA agent. And John Grinder was a Green Beret and a CIA agent before he became a linguist. And Richard Bandler, who was a mathematician, and they were studying therapists. So, two things that seem to have not very much similarities, and yet trying to map structure to structure. And I think that's where you find a lot of this kind of the moments of genius, the moments of that 1% inspiration. Well, I was doing a study of leaders in different companies, high-level leaders that had been very successful in transforming companies, large companies. And one of the characteristics I found of these leaders was that they all had hobbies that were strange, that were unusual. Like one guy who was a chief executive of a huge European car company, a multi-billion-dollar company, multi-billion-dollar company, had two hobbies. One was classical piano, and the other was neurophysiology. This is a chief executive of a car company. And when he would have problems that he was trying to solve in the company, he would make analogies to music or to neurology. If this company was a nervous system, what would I need to do? If it was music, what would I do? And I think that those are often very, very important parts of creativity, certainly. Any other observations, questions, issues?
I'm an artist and art teacher,
Yes.
and my familiar one was that I would prepare for an art show.
Right.
Get all my art things ready and all the things. And then the new thing would be is that this summer I'm going to do like 3 small introductory classes to NLP.
Wow.
So it's been kind of interesting to see how I could.
I think we could bring a little artistry into the teaching of NLP. We could make it more like an art show if people would. Yeah, that sounds very intriguing. Were you able to be productive in the?
Yes. I know that some of the things that I need to be working on would be things like organization of materials and procedures and things
Right.
like that that I normally don't do. The
Right.
paperwork.
Yeah, yeah,
So it would be a challenge.
yeah. But I think, what I'm hearing is that the idea of preparing to do a training seminar in NLP, using as an analogy preparing to do an art show, and the structure, the deeper structure of preparing to do an art show, is leading you to think about things that you would, maybe even that you know about, but that you don't emphasize in the way that you typically prepare. And in fact, this leads me to something anyway that I've been wanting to get to, and I think it is an important one of our core concepts. It's a kind of an NLP concept, although it's not exclusive to NLP. And I think it does say something about genius, and it has to do with what I would call different levels of deep structure. And for example, to make an analogy between two things that are similar, very often you don't have to go very deep to find the analogy. You have, well, this is goals and that's goals, and this is this and that's that. When you go to compare things that are farther apart, often you have to find a deeper level of structure. And actually in the front of the book, just to give some language and maybe some examples to this, on page 2, I was talking about levels of modeling, but I think we could also say that these are levels of relationships and levels of deep structure too. In that I can try to model something, or I can try to map something across, like we're doing with our analogies, on a purely behavior level. In other words, I could say, what is it that I do behaviorally when I'm preparing for an art show, and what is it that I do behaviorally when I'm teaching a course? That's one level. Or I could say, what is it that I do mentally? How do I think? How do I organize my mind when I'm preparing for an art show? What kind of things do I visualize or whatever versus doing a course? Or I could go to a deeper level, which would be things like, what is it that I value? And what are the beliefs that I have when I'm preparing for an art show versus doing an NLP training course? Or how do I perceive myself? What is my identity when I do one and when I do another? And I think that sometimes the degree of innovation is sparked by at how deep a level that you go to. That is, to change your behavior a little bit doesn't necessarily make a big transformation. To have a shift in your perception of your identity makes a big change. If I am teaching a course, but I perceive myself as an artist, that's going to really make a total difference in how I do that course. Maybe even more so than if I use the same strategy for preparing materials. And I also believe that when we were talking about it in one group at the end of the exercise, that I think that genius also has to do with at which level of transformation you achieve. Einstein did not just come up with new mathematical equations. Einstein changed our whole beliefs about the universe. So I think part of the contribution of the people that we call geniuses have to do with the fact that they don't just give us a new kind of creative way to mix things. I was talking with Michael and Elaine about this in terms of this strategy, that there's still the place where the miracle happens. You know, that you can't really just say that, well, the Mona Lisa is a result of cutting and pasting this eye and that mouth and these ears, that somehow in doing many, many explorations, there was some kind of an intuition that Leonardo came up with that wasn't on the same level as, oh, this is pretty, oh yeah, that looks nice, oh yeah, this looks cute. It was something different. And I do also believe, and it's one of the things that I'm going to share this in a little while when we're kind of summarizing some of our principles of genius for today. I do believe that geniuses are people that also in their work are serving a mission beyond their specific work. As an example, somebody once asked Einstein why he got into physics. And he didn't say, well, you know, it seemed like a good place to get a Nobel Prize, you know, or he didn't say, because everybody else was stupid or whatever. He said, his answer was, he said, well, I want to know how God created the universe. He said, I'm really not interested in how far away that planet is or what color that spectrum of light is or what weight that atomic element is. He said, I want to know God's thoughts. Everything else is details. And in his opening, the first words of his anatomy, in his work on anatomy, Leonardo said, I wish to work miracles. That's what I'm doing. That's why I'm doing this. And I think even we'll see that Mozart said that Mozart, in spite of how he's portrayed in the movie as being kind of an ego-oriented person and stuff, did not have any ego at all with respect to his music. He said it was like it came from this sort of divine experience. And I think that, to me, that is at least one of the key elements of genius, is that it isn't just intellectual, and it isn't just putting things together. I do believe, and the reason that I'm teaching these as quote-unquote strategies of genius, is that I think they help you to manifest your inspiration. They help you to manifest your mission and vision. So I did want to bring that up because we will now, as we go on, also be referring back to issues relating to the things like values, identity, mission, and transformation on different levels.
Is miracle
Yes.
what you call spirituality?
Yeah. Anna's saying, is this miracle something that we would call spiritual or spirituality? I think that in a certain way, the way that I would describe it is I think the miracle happens when we line up all of these different levels. That is, a miracle happens not just because somebody has a spiritual awareness, but it's when that awareness lines up with a sense of identity and a set of beliefs and a set of very specific skills and capabilities and a certain action in a certain time and place. That's when there's a miracle. And that's why I think we also need to acknowledge that, you know, there's a certain aspect of genius. For example, Einstein's contribution of the theory of relativity couldn't have happened 20 years before. It happened to be this right idea in this right time in this place, so on and so forth. If Mozart was writing his music today, it might go unnoticed. Because they're going, that doesn't sound like rock and roll to me. So in other words, that there's also this lining up of all of the right pieces together.
Kind of like in Field of Dreams when the tongues
Yeah.
all come together.
Yes. Yeah. I was describing my experience of being in front of Leonardo's painting of the Last Supper. And it's not just an interesting combination of people and faces. It is an interesting combination of faces for certain, but it's not just that. It's also, if you defocused your eyes and just looked at it, it would be very aesthetically interesting the way he did it. But also, he chose this very interesting moment to portray. All of the other people that painted the Last Supper, this part of the New Testament, this part of the story of the New Testament, didn't paint the moment he chose to paint. He chose to paint the moment after Jesus says, someone will betray me. One of you will betray me. And he chose to paint like the second after those words came out. And as a result, you have a much more interesting painting than if you had a bunch of people sitting there, watching somebody. And I was saying it's sort of like the character of the people is there. You know exactly what kind of people they are. Whereas if you'd painted the 2 minutes before he said that, you wouldn't know anything about them. They could be easily, one could be easily the other one. But because there's this moment of tension, and it's one of the things actually that Leonardo said. He said that he didn't use exactly these words, but I think he said nature, but I think what he meant was that a system shows its nature most in the times of extremes. It's under the extreme condition that we most reveal things about ourselves. And I know that, for example, in my study of leadership, that very often the effective leaders have the most impact in these moments of sort of symbolic times when they really show what they're made of. Because you can say all the things that you want as a leader. You can talk about mission, 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 vision, 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 values, values, values. But it's in the time when things are in an extreme state that you really reveal it. And I think that somebody like Leonardo, I was even saying that was one of his strategies. And I'll explain in just a second. Dre?
You've talked about inspiration at various times. What's the structure of inspiration?
I don't know if it has a structure. I mean, it may be contradiction. Yeah. See, I think that's a little bit like we were saying about preparing the soil. In a certain way, and Michael and I were talking about this, I'm not suggesting that the strategies, we've done a couple of things today, we'll do even more in the coming days, tomorrow, and we have one more thing to do before we close today as well. But I'm not suggesting that these things make genius. I think that they are strategies of genius, but it's more like they're the ways of preparing the soil to be open to something and to manifest it when it's there. I think that Michael was talking about, I'm probably not going to pronounce his name right, Röntgen, the man who discovered X-rays.
Yeah,
Röntgen. That he didn't create them. It was sort of an accident. He just happened to notice it, but the genius was in recognizing it and sort of being ready. And somebody else who saw the same phenomenon might not have ever recognized it. It's what I always thought about something like NLP. People have watched other people's eyes move around for years. They've been doing it for probably thousands of years. But the genius was to go, what is that? I wonder if that means something, I wonder if it's just random, their eyes kind of flop around, or if there's something meaningful, and then what system can you use to make meaning out of it? That's where you get the little stroke of genius, if you will. I do think that inspiration does also come from a sort of a search.
Search?
Yeah. I guess the only other thing I would say too, what I mean about structure is that when I remember seeing my children when they were first born, I think that there's sort of being wide open to inspiration, but at that point you don't have all the strategies yet. And it's almost like not losing that childhood sense until you get actually the tools that it takes to make things. That what happens with many people is that they lose the childhood openness as they develop the tools, the strategies. And the key is if you can kind of keep them both together so that you don't lose them. Anyway, that's one answer. I think the other bit that we've been talking about too is that maybe one of the sources for inspiration is holding the question. Having the question to begin with. For example, Michael keeps asking me, he says, well, these things are all strategies, and they're, yes, they're, in a certain level, they're simple. You can follow them and do them. We can teach them to people. But he says on another level, they are complex. They are built out of more fundamental processes. And he keeps asking me, what are the atoms of genius? Not the molecules, or if you will. And I haven't been able to answer his question yet, but having the question, then I think makes it more possible to have the inspiration. Einstein called it the holy curiosity of inquiry. Holy curiosity. So by the way, some of these, sometimes I haven't said this yet to Drake or to Michael, but sometimes I think that people ask questions that are much too good to ruin by answering them, It's like, that's a great question. I don't want to ruin it by answering it, It's too good of a question. Because I think what happens is that, you get an answer and you close the door, or you get an answer and you immediately start, going, yeah, it's not that, it's not that. But if you can hold the question, where does inspiration come from? What are the atoms of genius? Yes.
Another question along those lines, and I know we're about to leave, but I thought you might point me in the right direction.
Yes.
Is how do the strategies of genius apply to someone like Christ?
That's an excellent question. I think that actually I've written a lot about Jesus' strategies. I have one thing I've written on the cognitive patterns of Jesus, kind of relating to how he thought. And I'm working on, there's a work I'm doing on the healing patterns of Jesus. And I think that certainly if we say that genius is something that relates to a spiritual connection and that changes people in a very fundamental way, we would have to say that somebody like Christ was a genius.
What did you write so I could buy it?
One,
Okay.
yeah. It's called the cognitive patterns of Jesus. And it's sort of looking at the ways in which Jesus thought. For example, to me, one of the things that I would say is a stroke of genius in the New Testament, in the descriptions of Jesus, was he was being pushed once by a group of people that were trying to sort of trick him and get him to argue about things. And they were asking him what he thought the greatest commandment was. And his answer, I thought, was really powerful. It was one of the most profound things I read, where he said that the most important commandment was to love your God with your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength. Which is different. He didn't say, well, you shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that and shouldn't do this. And it's a little bit, I think encoded in that is a little bit like what we're after in strategies of genius. He did not respond to the question at face value. He went to the deeper structure of the question. He didn't answer on a surface level. You should do this and shouldn't do that or shouldn't do this. It was, well, what is the intention? What is the deeper structure of that? And I think that's the same thing that all geniuses do. Einstein didn't think of time as being what your watch said. To ask Einstein the question, what time is it? It would be really opening yourself up. Right? That's like or, as Einstein said to the train conductor, what time does Zurich arrive at this train? But I mean, it's shifting it. It's shifting the answer to a different level. And I think that is a core of genius. Some of these, by the way, since part of the reason we have other days in the program too is so that we don't have to try to answer everything in the first day. And as I was kind of alluding to, I think taking stock of what some of your questions are. Because I think sometimes the value of coming to a program like this is that you get experiences and you also have things to compare against Genius. Where you can say, yeah, I see that's a part of it, but I think there's something more than that. What's more? What is it that's more than what we've done? And then that's something that we can go on to next. I wanted to kind of bring a little bit of closure to what we were doing on Leonardo. One thing, somebody asked me, and I thought it was a very interesting question. He said, you know, is this thing with Leonardo, is its purpose to get us to sort of jump to a different level of seeing things, because we're trying to put all these different pieces together? Or is it to get to be more practically creative? Because he was saying, on the one hand, is he was getting ideas and putting the pieces together, but they seemed more practical ideas than things that he'd come up with before. And I was saying, well, I think in a way it's to do both. I think that kind of working with these different syntheses and combinations, again, if we go back to what Beth was saying and what Jan was saying this morning, on the one hand, you are putting things together in new ways, but on another hand, you know, another level, you're jumping up to something that is deeper. And I think that's one of the values of Leonardo's strategy, is that Leonardo coming up with all these amazing machines that he came up with was certainly, he was a very realistic thinker, but he was also a very innovative thinker. He went both ways. He could be completely innovative and come up with things that nobody before him had thought of, and yet come up with them in a way that he could draw these pictures. And I was telling somebody that in Milan they have a Leonardo museum where they've actually built, they decided to do a project where they would try to build all of his machines. And they're remarkably practical. They couldn't always build them in his time, but now we can build them, and they work. So that's the interesting thing, I think, about the strategy, or at least what it's leading to. There is a final element to the strategy, which is, after you start synthesizing these things, I'm kind of remembering back to Beth this morning, where you go, oh, look, that's it, you know. It's where do you get that point where you go, oh, yeah, this is an interesting idea. Oh, yeah, and I can put them together that way, too. And, oh, yeah, here's another place, and here's another way. There's that certain point where you go, that's the one. And I think, of course, that's part of what separates the Leonardo and the Mozart from the other composers, is that sense of going, that's it. It's this combination that does it. And that relates to, I think, the best that we can approach it for this afternoon is, I think that relates to what we would call in NLP criteria or values, which are different than the goals. You can say that, well, you know, Mozart had a goal when he was writing a symphony, but he also had values or criteria. In other words, his goal in writing a symphony might be to produce something of this length for this client, you know, to make a mass that has 5 parts and so on and so forth. But his criteria was to find the notes that loved each other. And that doesn't matter what the outcome is. I mean, you apply that criterion no matter what outcome you have. So one feature of criterion is that there are things like beauty or, you know, quality, symmetry, something like that, that are not goal-oriented or goal-related, but relate to this higher level, the higher level qualities. And just to, if we were to finish the Leonardo strategy, you would see that at the bottom of page 13, there is a little place for those, a place for the so-called criteria. And if you were going to make a listing of the criteria, if for example, if I was going to find Gary's criteria for improving his communication, Gary has all these different things, teaching, passing time, using metaphors, you know, accomplishing things, but I would say, Gary, what is it that this really is going to mean to you? What is its how do you know that you really improved your skill at communicating? How do you know that because he used one word, which was improve, but our question would be, how would you know it's improved? Feel it. Could you give any words to the, what would be, the words he's going to use in a moment are going to be our criteria words. What qualities would that feeling have? Flow?
Well, the first word that came to mind was like elixir.
Elixir.
Yeah, and then upper body sensation, comfort, flow.
Yeah. So however, the point is that however Gary puts together those things, whether it has humor and it's learning and it's fun, it would have to have that flow, that elixir and that comfort. And if it didn't, he'd either need to make it have that or go, that's not the right combination. That one doesn't fit. If we went to Margaret, we would say, Margaret, your book that you're going to write has chapters and it has formats and it has a lot of other things with it. But what is the criteria that it would have to satisfy for it to really be a good book, the book that you want to write?
Save a dog's life by getting it in a home that
Save-
the people understood it.
Yeah. So that's a very powerful thing. And even listen to, we were talking about with mission. She says, well, actually, it will serve this kind of larger mission, which is saving an animal's life. It's got to, in other words, if I'm Margaret and I'm writing a book whose purpose is to save lives, that's different than writing a book whose purpose is to inform or for me to make money as an author or whatever. And I think that's profound. Yeah, but that might be a second criterion. Someone else was talking about this. We said we can have criterion that may sound that aren't the same, but they're also not necessarily contradictory. I might want to make money and save lives. The two things are not incompatible. The question is finding the right combination of chapters and formats that do that.
And educate people.
Yeah. So again, what then Margaret does at the bottom is she writes down, this is the vision. These are the key words that represent the vision behind this. This is Einstein saying, I want to know God's thoughts. This is Leonardo saying, I want to work a miracle. I want to portray to you this human body in a certain way. And that, I think, gives you a very deep sense of guidance. Helen, in this trainer training that you're doing, I mean, there's all kinds of different combinations and different structures. What does it have to do?
It has to create an elegant presentation. And for me, an elegant presentation is one that evokes a deeper sense of connection with the material.
Yes.
And a sense of joy and playfulness.
Joy, playfulness,
in
connection.
experiencing the material.
Yes.
So that you have that aha.
Yes.
When I watch somebody do yoga, and they've
Yeah.
got all those three elements
Yeah.
going together, I look
That's-
at them and it's like,
Yeah. That's,
it makes me want to run out and do it.
yeah. And that's the kind of thing where you go, that's beautiful. Something that's beautiful has that. And that would be your final guide, because I think otherwise what you end up with is a whole lot of different possible combinations, and you go, yeah, that's all interesting, but it's like walking into a supermarket where you've got 50 brands of the same kind of food, or the same kind of, television, and you're going, which one should I buy? Which one's for me? And so these are often very deeply emotionally related and personally related. Yes, Pro?
I'm interested, intrigued, and slightly confused by your statement about Mozart's motivation.
Yes.
The prolificness of that great artist.
Yes.
The amazing movement in his work, and yet a statement saying finding two notes that love each other.
Yes.
I don't understand. It must be a series of billions of two
Yes,
notes
yes,
that love
yes.
each other.
Yes. Yes.
And yet, that just still to me seems, I don't know.
Well, Pearl, we actually will, that's one of those things, let's hold that question, because I think that's a good question.
I'm particularly intrigued because I'm very interested in, and I'm involved in songwriting.
Yes.
So, holding the question,
Yes.
I understand can be
Well, but we're going
creative and
to,
helpful.
but what I'm saying is that actually we're going to get specifically to Mozart later, and I think that part of of your question at least will be answered by Mozart himself in his comments. And let's take, there's two parts to the question. One is, well, how do you account for prolificness in somebody who just goes on looking for these notes? There's got to be other criterion. There's more to it than that. The amount of volume that you produce. Because he could have produced one perfect symphony and said, that's it. All the notes love each other. So why did he continue doing more? Number two, as Pearl says, what is still something that she doesn't have yet is how you get from the two notes that love each other to, a whole symphony or an opera. Because they're made out of many, many thousands and thousands of notes that love each other. And that's overwhelming. I mean, when we try to do that cognitively, analytically, consciously, it's overwhelming. And I think that's also why it appears so magical to us. And yet, the thing I think that's powerful about Mozart's comment, and it will be powerful about his strategy, is that it does not start from complexity. It's a little bit like what Michael's after with was the basic element. The basic element of writing the music, in Mozart's case, is not all the cognitive knowledge about what parts go into a symphony, but this element of finding the notes.
Does he give any indication as to which two notes, whether they need to be juxtaposed or whether they're in certain places?
He doesn't give you, he doesn't tell you which notes, but he tells you how to find them. He tells you more how to find them.
All right.
We'll go to that. What I'd like to do as a part of our final closing here, I want to do one more thing. We're going to do a little bit from, going to kind of put together Leonardo and Nikola Tesla a little bit. And I do also want to take an opportunity at the end of today to begin to summarize a few of the key patterns of genius. For me, a pattern of genius is different than a strategy of genius. A strategy of genius is a mental operation that you go through. Okay, it's like having a bunch of pictures and connecting them, or it's like listing things and integrating them. A pattern of genius is what is it that is shared or common to a number of different geniuses. The pattern doesn't necessarily tell you how specifically do you do it, but it says this is a characteristic. So I've got about 21 of them in the back of the book, so I figured we could probably take them, 7 at a time. We say in NLP, 7 is you can manage. 21 would be too much. So I think the first 7 will probably give us some insights and a review of what we did today. Then we're going to do a closing meditation. So if you look at page 28, we're just going to go through the first 7 there. One is, page 28, one pattern of genius is that they have a highly developed ability to visualize. And even though they use other senses too, visualization does seem to be a common feature. Even people that weren't doing visual things used visualization. 2, they have numerous links between the senses. This is this idea of synesthesia that we were talking about. That they don't only see things. If they only saw it, even if they had a highly developed ability to visualize, I think it would be either trivial or it would just stay a dream. So remember, even though Disney said you have to see everything, then he would feel the characters as well. 3, they use multiple perspectives, meaning that they see things from different points of view. And this will become even more obvious as we go to some of the people like Einstein. But even Leonardo, one of the things that Leonardo says when he was making his anatomy, I'll just read a small section. He's talking about how he was going to show the human body. And he says the human body, this depicting of the human body will be as clear to you as if you had the natural man before you. And the reason is that if you wish to thoroughly know the parts of a man anatomically, you or your eye requires to see it from different aspects, considering it from below and from above and from its sides, turning it about and seeking the origin of each member. And in this way, the natural anatomy is sufficient for your comprehension. And he actually says, and he follows through in his anatomy, everything he draws from different points of view. And he, again, so much as says, understanding means having multiple perspectives of it. There's no one perspective that is the right perspective. And I think the same, we could certainly see the same thing in Disney. He said, well, you got to get a second look at it. Then you got to look at it from your audience perspective. Then you got to look at it and see if there's this. So he had multiple perspectives. Number 4, highly developed ability for switching between what we call perceptual positions. This means, this is something we haven't gone into too much yet. It's a idea of a perceptual position that's a little different than a perspective would be the following. If I'm Leonardo looking at something and turning it around, that's different perspectives. I can see it, but I'm still in my perceptual position. If I step into it, if I become that which I'm observing, then I've actually switched a perceptual position. So the perspective means I'm here in my position looking at it from different points of view, but it's still my point of view. When I change perceptual position, I step into it. For example, many people who are professional race car drivers talk about how they become their car. It's not like they're sitting there inside the car and the car is something that they're trying to turn. Their feeling of the edge of their own body is the bumper of the car. You probably all have had that kind of experience, even if you're not familiar with it, when you write. You really don't perceive the end of your pencil as being where it's putting pressure on your fingers. It's like you perceive the point. So it's a different thing than just a perspective. Again, we'll go into this a little bit more later. Disney, for instance, becoming a member of his audience or becoming one of his characters is not just getting a different perspective, it is literally a different perception. Mickey Mouse will perceive reality differently even if he has the same point of view than Goofy. At least I think so. 5, the ability to move back and forth between different chunk sizes and levels of thinking. This is something that has to do with moving between the big picture and the little pieces. And that's part of what we started to do today with Leonardo. And it's also a characteristic of Disney. Disney would see the whole picture, but to make an animated film, you have to take this vision in your mind and break it into 25 pictures for every second. That's how you animate something. So this very beautiful picture, an hour's worth of a fantasy, has to become 25 separate pictures a second. Obviously with Leonardo, what he was doing is going back and forth between synthesis, here's a face, and pieces. This kind of nose, this kind of eyes, this kind of ears. So that movement back and forth between the components and the synthesis, components and synthesis. And I think going all the way back to this morning with Jan and with Beth, we saw that dance. A feedback loop, number 6, a feedback loop between abstract and concrete. That you could also say between deep structure and surface structure. The abstract thing might be, I want to save lives. The concrete thing is this particular chapter in my book. And I've got to be able to manage that. Or an abstract quality like beauty and a concrete representation, like a painting. Finally, and this one leads us to what I'm kind of going into Tesla to end today. They make internal models that run on their own without conscious direction. What does that mean? What that means is that many of these geniuses would begin to create a representation of something that was so rich that it took on a life of its own. I remember reading an interview with Edward Albee, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright. He wrote Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and stuff. And he described how when he was writing his plays, what he would do is just periodically check in on what was happening and write it down, you know. And then he'd wait a little bit longer and check in on what was happening and write it down, because the play would write itself. As we'll discover with Mozart, he did a very similar thing. At a certain point in his composition, the symphony would finish itself. Tesla would create, as we'll see, he would create these machines in his mind. And let's, in fact, take a look at this. Let's see. I think we have time to read a few things here. If you look at page 14, this is sort of giving you an even deeper insight into the mind of a genius. We've been reading things that Leonardo said and reading things that Disney said, but I think some of the stuff that Tesla wrote here is some of the most personally revealing. And he says, this is from an interview with him. It was in 1911 or something. He said, "In my boyhood, I suffered from a peculiar affliction due to the appearance of images, often accompanied by strong flashes of light, which marred the sight of real objects and interfered with my thought and action." So in other words, he'd get some kind of an image that would come in and distract him. When I was little, they called it daydreaming. They were pictures of things and scenes which I'd already seen. This is important. They were things I'd already seen, never of those I imagined. So he'd suddenly have a memory come out or something. When a word was spoken to me, the image of the object designated would present itself vividly to my imagination. And sometimes I was quite unable to distinguish whether what I saw was tangible or not. It caused me great discomfort and anxiety. To give an idea of my distress, suppose that I'd witnessed a funeral or some such nerve-wracking spectacle. Then inevitably, in the stillness of the night, a vivid picture of the scene would thrust itself before my eyes and persist despite all my efforts to banish it. Sometimes it would even remain fixed in space, though I pushed my hand through it. So this is an interesting situation, and you know, probably 99% of the people that have that experience end up in a mental hospital or something. It's a hallucination. But clearly, notice he's saying it was a problem. He wasn't going, "Oh wow, this is great, I can be a genius." It's a problem. And incidentally, I don't think that it's such an uncommon thing. I think all of us as children, because I know my children are still going through that stage, have difficulties distinguishing at times between their reality and what they dream or what they remember. We just sort of make sure that they learn how to disappear those pictures. But let's find out what Tesla did. He said, "To free myself of these tormenting appearances, I tried to concentrate my mind on something else I had seen. And in this way, I would often obtain temporary relief. But in order to get it, I had to conjure continuously new images. It was not long before I'd found that I'd exhausted all of those at my command. My reel had run out, as it were, because I had seen so little of the world, only objects in my home and immediate surroundings." So what he's saying that he would do is he'd try to remember something else instead. You know, yeah, I replace it with something else I can remember, like a picture of my doorknob or something. However, he said he hadn't seen that many things. So he ran out. As I performed these mental operations for the second or third time in order to chase the appearances from my vision, the remedy gradually lost all its force. Now I know that Freud would have a heyday with these. Why it lost all its force, but nonetheless the experience was he kept trying to project memories and it wasn't good enough because they couldn't. Yes.
Habituates to
Yeah.
the new images.
Yes. And I also think that probably he gives a clue. He said that the ones that kind of appeared also had emotional charges to them. So you have to find something that's at least as emotionally gripping. But now here's what he does. He says, "Then I instinctively commenced to make excursions beyond the limits of the small world of which I had knowledge. I saw new scenes. These were at first very blurred and indistinct." I think that's a really important comment. Because many people, when they try to use their imagination, they go, "I'm not very good at it. It's indistinct. It's not clear." And so they stopped doing it. They go, oh, there's people who are good at it. Now, this guy, I'll guarantee you, was probably one of the best visualizers in the world, but he didn't start out that way. And so notice, it started off indistinct.
Is he saying that things he saw outside of him were blurred and indistinct, or is he referring to
Imagination. Yeah.
His imagination.
His imagination.
He tried to call those things back up.
Yes. So when he would try to imagine something new, it would be like if I tried to imagine floating above the room right now, I might not have a very distinct picture at first. I kind of have a vague image of a few people down below me and stuff. So it's blurry. It doesn't grab my attention. But that's how he would start. He says, and they would flit away when I tried to concentrate my attention on them. How many of us have that? The interesting thing about this guy is that he persisted. Because he had a reason to, I guess. He said, by and by I succeeded in fixing them, and they gained in strength and distinctness, and finally assumed the concreteness of real things. I soon discovered that my best comfort was attained if I simply went on in my vision. Where did we hear that this morning, Beth? Farther and farther, getting new impressions all the time. And so I began to travel, of course, in my mind. So he would go into a fantasy world. Every night, and sometimes during the day, when alone, I would start on my journeys, see new places, cities, and countries, live there, meet people, and make friendships and acquaintances, and however unbelievable, it is a fact that they were just as dear to me as those in actual life, and not a bit less intense in their manifestation. Now again, I think having a fantasy world is a characteristic of almost all children. It's just that we sort of stop them eventually from doing it. That's not practical, or it's dangerous, even. Or, we say, why live in a fantasy world? Come back to reality. But I think it was that, whatever allowed him to pursue it, that was that little tiny key to the genius. So the next part of the story, top of the next page. He says, I was about 17 when my thoughts turned seriously to invention. Then I observed to my delight that I could visualize with the greatest facility. I needed no models, drawings, or experiments. I could picture them all as real in my mind. Thus, I've been led unconsciously to evolve what I consider to be a new method of materializing inventive concepts and ideas, which is radically opposite to the purely experimental and is, in my opinion, ever so much more expeditious and efficient. Now remember, I said he was a contemporary and, in fact, a competitor of Edison. And Edison was the, trial and error guy. It took, to do the light bulb, it took him 14 months and 5,000 different, possible trials. This is, I don't know if he says it here, but Tesla called that the needle in the haystack approach. He says, the moment one constructs a device to carry into practice a crude idea, he finds himself unavoidably engrossed with the details and defects of its appearance, of his apparatus. So it's interesting. And I think whether or not you have the capability to visualize like Tesla, there's a certain point where, and I believe this, if you go to the realist and the critic too soon, then you get caught up in the details. I don't know how many people I know that try to write a book, they start writing the first sentences down, and they start correcting their spelling. Then they go, no, I shouldn't really say it that way. And what happens is they get stuck on sentence number 1. And that, of course, sidetracks you, takes you out of that state. Instead of having the colorful light and moving pictures, all of a sudden you get stuck. So I do think there's a certain gestation period that needs to happen. So as he goes on improving and reconstructing, his force of concentration diminishes and he loses sight of the great underlying principle. They get caught in the surface structure and lose the deep structure. Results may be obtained, but always at the sacrifice of quality. Very interesting thing. By the way, we'll reflect again when we compare this to Mozart later on, and how Mozart never, Mozart didn't make drafts and drafts of his material. Yeah. And I think that that's what Tesla is saying, something similar, in a completely different area. Okay. So, he says, my method is different. I don't rush into the actual work, meaning I don't become a realist too soon. When I get an idea, I start at once building it up in my imagination. I change the construction, make improvements, operate the device in my mind. It's absolutely immaterial to me whether I run my turbine engine in thought or test it in my shop. I even note if it's out of balance. There's no difference whatever, the results are the same. In this way, I'm able to rapidly develop and perfect a conception without touching anything. Sounds, again, we'll see what Mozart did with music. Now, incidentally, just so you know, somebody went, I think he said that in this interview, and somebody went, "Give me a break." You know, you can't do that. You know, that's just your ego talking. And so they did this challenge that Tesla participated in, where they actually took a real turbine engine, and he made one in his mind, and they started them at exactly the same moment. And 3 months later, they came back, and he disassembled the turbine engine in his mind, measured it, told them where all the wear was in it and how deep it was and all of that, you know, where the grooves were and stuff. And when they disassembled the real one and measured it, it was exactly the same as what he saw in his mind. That's what I mean about making something that runs unconsciously in your mind. Because he wasn't sitting there every day calculating it. He just started it and let it go. But we human beings have that capacity. This is the thing, I think, where we get stuck, and it relates to conscious and unconscious process. We can start something going, go to sleep, and it still goes on, even if our conscious mind doesn't. You can get an idea, get it halfway done, and wake up the next morning and it's finished. And that's, I think, even though it sounded strange when I first said that, about it running on its own, I think the key is that you've got to get enough of it going, get enough of your senses involved, get enough perspectives, enough of this association, and then it'll do it on its own. Because that's what our nervous system was designed to do. It's a, quote-unquote, a neural network. Just to finish, he said, when I've gone so far as to embody the invention in every possible improvement I can think of and see no fault anywhere, I put into concrete form this final product of my brain. Invariably, the device works as I conceived that it should, and the experiment comes out exactly as I planned it. In 20 years, there's not been a single exception. It's like a little bit like Mozart. Why should it be otherwise? Engineering and electrical and mechanical is positive in results. Engineering, electrical, and mechanical is positive in results. There's scarcely a subject that cannot be mathematically treated and the effects calculated or the results determined beforehand from the available theoretical and practical data. I think he's trying to justify it here. The carrying out into practice of a crude idea, as is generally being done, I hold nothing but a waste of energy, money, and time. I think he was. I think he was.
Did he use a pen and paper for his calculations, or did he do all that?
He did that. He did that in there. Actually, the interesting thing about Tesla, my father was a patent attorney, you know, who wrote people's inventions, and many of Tesla's ideas were so far ahead of his time that nobody could write his patents, and he had to write them for himself. So he wrote most of his own patents because nobody else could understand it. And my father was an electrical engineer, and he said that people were still going back and studying Tesla's work because it's still ahead in some ways. Now, I believe that one of the things that Tesla did was to go out into a vision. I mean, I think his practice when he was little of going into a vision of these imaginary people could also have prepared him to be able to, in a sense, go into a vision of the future. He's the one, incidentally, that first conceived of robots. He called them automata. And actually I have a quote in the book where he says, yeah, he makes this very prophetic comment that someday these are going to revolutionize the way industry happens. And of course, at that time, everybody went, what are you talking about? You know, you're crazy. Yeah. So, yeah. So, what I want to say a couple of things about this that I think is important. One is, I think it comes from that basic ability of letting your dreamer go. Part of what today is our dreamer day. Part of what Tesla was saying is that paradoxically, giving more time to your dreamer makes your ideas more realistic. Because giving more time to your dreamer actually makes your ideas more realistic. Most people would go, the dreamer and the realist are two different things. But what he was saying is, if I dream it enough, then it's more tangible, it's more perfect. And I think some of us don't spend enough time with our dreams. It doesn't mean that we don't also need certain information, but I think it's that opening to the dreamer. As our closing meditation, I wanted to do a little bit with dreaming. And what I'd like to do, if we can, I know that Ed fudged this for us. I know it's 5:30 already, but we can do a little closing meditation. I'm going to actually kind of inspire it from the book. So, I know we started today with having you explore a little bit about your dreamer. I'd like to end today with doing some more with your dreamer. This morning we were kind of analyzing your dreamer. You were breaking it into pieces. At the end of today, and I think we're all ready for this, I'd like you to just go into the dream. You don't have to analyze it. You've learned some things about it today. But I'd like to just ask you to invite the dreamer in you to come out. And a good first step in that is, of course, to get yourself in a good, comfortable body position, a physiology that supports your dreaming. For some of you, that might be a sense of movement. For some of you, that might be a sense of quiet. Whatever that is for you. If your physiology were able to put you in a state where you could really let out the dreamer in you, how would you be sitting? How would you be breathing? What kind of muscle tension would you feel in your body? What would be the quality of your inner voice if you were really able to dream? Would it be like Beth's that says, oh, look, look, look? Or would it just be quiet? Would it just be a sound? Maybe be encouraging and questioning. Maybe you're just confident, commenting on what you're noticing. But just take the moment to tune your internal voice to the quality of voice that leads you to your dreams. And then when your body is ready, your feelings and your voice is ready, you can begin to visualize a special kind of dream. I'd like to have you imagine, if you will, a dream of the future. If you could make a beautiful dream for a kind of world to which you would want to belong in the future, and to which others would want to belong, what would that future be like? If, like Disney said, it was big and it was bright, what would that dream be? If you could dream up your own version of a utopia, what would your vision be? How would technology fit into this global dream? What would happen to war? How would your children or the children of others be educated? How would people from different parts of the world communicate with each other? In what ways would you use the tools that we have now in service of this future in a more creative or ecological way? And just gently allow your dream to move you into the future as if it was taking you along on a flowing stream of water or air. Maybe thinking about what would medicine be like in the future. Would people still go to doctors as we have them now? Would there be hospitals? If you could change the world just by dreaming it, by visualizing it, how would you transform the hospitals and the schools and the companies? What would the office of the future look like? Would it even be an office? How would people travel? If you were able to put yourself, project yourself into the future. Imagine that maybe there was a device that you had that could manifest whatever you dreamed, so that the only limits of reality were the limits of your imagination. How could you go beyond those limits? How would we treat animals and plants? What would be the most important job in the future? This future that you can gently and comfortably dream. What kind of music would people listen to in the future? What would the museums of the future be like? If you went to a museum in the future and saw the artifacts of today, what would be the most amusing to the people of the future? What could you dream that would change the world the most? Which parts of your life and our lives have the most space to change? Imagine that you could change the world just through something that you did. Dream about what you would do or could do. And let your unconscious mind continue that dream in the way that's most appropriate for you. In a way that gives you a sense of pleasure, excitement, or hope. And then for a moment, just for a moment, allow your mind to shift from the future to the past. Think back over your life and find a time when a dream came true for you. Remember something that one time had been just a dream for you, and later on you discovered that somehow it had come true. Remember, as I said this morning, 20 years ago when I first got involved in NLP, I had a dream about studying the strategies of genius, and writing books and doing a seminar. And today, the reality of it is that today, you, sitting in this room right now, are that dream come true. 20 years ago, I dreamed that maybe I would be doing something like this. And you, right now, for me, are that dream come true. You are part of a dream. And there are many other dreams. I remember dreaming about having my children, dreaming about things that NLP could contribute to the areas of health. Many, many of those dreams have come true. The problem is, or the issue is, that when they do come true, we forget that at once they were just a dream, because now they're reality. Now it's just another lousy day in paradise. I'd like to maybe invite you to think of a few of the things that you dreamed of that have come true. Maybe some of you have become the person that you dreamed that you might be at some time in your life. One of the things that I think that we are designed to be and to do as human beings are to make dreams come true. That they happen every day. In this room that we're sitting in, it would be very difficult to find a single thing that wasn't at one point a dream. The microphone that I'm speaking to wasn't always here. The carpet, the chairs that you're sitting in, the clothes that you're wearing, all of these things started off at one point as the dream in somebody's mind. And for us though, now that it's reality, it's just reality. So as you find yourself now coming back to the present, from the future and the past, take a moment and notice what are your current dreams. What are the dreams that brought you here to this seminar? Some of you through difficult circumstances, traveling. What are the dreams that motivate you, that you pursue now? Albert Einstein said, knowledge of what is, even the most clear and complete knowledge of what is, does not tell us what could be or should be. Only our dreams tell us that.